Okay, in this video I want to talk about the role of women in society and how it could be organised differently if it wasn't for big business, big government and feminism. So currently many women choose to work in the fields of nursing or education or caring roles, and they do that as a paid role, and they call that a career, which is fine. Certainly I'm not saying that they should be stuck in houses, as is commonly painted the image of history by feminists. But I don't think history was really like that, and nor do I think it really has to be that way. If in most of society 97% of people would live in rural settings, most likely on farms or small farms, with maybe 3% in the cities doing administration type office work. In a society that's organised like that, which I must admit is much more sustainable than our current one because it relies on human labour rather than fossil fuels, there's very little opportunity or need for people to be in administrative or senior roles. That's why you have only sort of 3% in the city and 97% in the country. So what are those 97% in the country doing? Well, they're earning their own living, making their own houses or making houses for each other. They're growing food, looking after stock, doing all the sorts of things that we now rely on industrial farming to do. So what do I think could be different? Well, I think instead of women working for big corporations and big organisations with a heavy bureaucracy telling them what to do, they could in fact be doing those same sorts of roles of nursing, teaching, caring, etc. in their communities, and probably not full-time, probably part-time, particularly if they haven't got children of their own, or if their children have grown up. While they have children of their own, of course they'll be busy, or they could be busy if they wanted to be, teaching them, raising them, working in the household, looking after them, and looking after, of course, the things on the farm or homestead that they would normally look after, their own little vegetable gardens, kitchen gardens, any stock they might have, as most households would have, and and so they would have a varied task. They wouldn't just be full time doing one thing. They'd probably be doing a range of things. So if they have their own children, well, then they'll be very busy with those, teaching them, probably more busy than they will be before they have children or after they have children. But after they have children or before they have children, they may well have time and opportunity to go and help others with these tasks. And that's where the nursing, teaching and caring roles would come in. But rather than being in institutionalised form, it would be in a much more community organised form, where people know each other, they care about each other, and they see who has a need and they go and provide for that need. This, I think, is a much better model than have an army of administrators trying to decide who needs what and allocating resources, and people doing it without really knowing or having a strong relationship with the people they're helping. So this I'm thinking of as a very close-knit community where people know each other, care about each other, and actually want to help each other. Very much what you would imagine an idyllic sort of Christian community might look like. I mean, that's not to say it won't have its problems. There is no heaven on earth, but I think the problems would be much less than what we have today, and at least people would be doing what they're doing by choice rather than, being allocated to it by some bureaucratic system. I think it's a lie of feminism that you're better off to work for some bureaucratic system than you and be under their control than you are under the control of the needs of your community. You might say, and you think, well, how's this supported? Well, they're supported in essence by the work of their husbands and the rest of the community. So the work of their husbands in growing crops, building them the things that they need. And in fact, not much changes with the modern society. The work of nurses and teachers is supported by the work of the rest of the community who actually produce the food and make things. So that doesn't change. It's still done by that. But instead of all those resources being allocated by taxes and government, they're determined by the individual families about how they're going to use those resources. So the husbands will probably be the ones mostly producing the food and the things that people need, not to say exclusively, but just because that tends to be the way people organise themselves. And and the women would then be free to do the nursing and the teaching and helping each other in those ways, which is an extremely important role. Um, so, and I think we'd end up with much happier, much closer knit communities with people who know each other better, are better able to support each other than we can through current bureaucratic administration systems. So I think this combination of feminism, telling people that, they're better to work for a boss than for a husband or community elders who actually know them and care about them, is a lie. We see that modern organisations don't really care about anyone. They use people, they're happy to throw them away, and they don't really give a damn what happens to them after that. A husband or a family or a patriarch, if you like, or a matriarch, whoever it is going to actually care about the people. And I think if you listen to people like Camille Paglia, who talks about how things worked in Italy, you end up with both a matriarchy and a patriarchy, each in their own domains. So the nursing, teaching area of the economy is basically run by matriarchs, and the production side of the economy, food and things, is basically run by patriarchs. I think this lie of that, being a patriarchy, is it just that? It's a lie. There were two systems. The male systems tend to be more formalised, and probably the female systems tended to be less formalised and more informal. But they were both systems. But what we've come to today is a sort of adoration of the formalised systems of hierarchy and formal roles and formal titles, and I think that's a kind of disease. And the other thing is that most the jobs the feminists are pushing when they say women have careers, they're not thinking about on the ground teachers and nurses. They're thinking about CEOs. They're thinking about high status jobs, and we know as Christians that those sorts of ambitions and the sort of pride and arrogance that comes from those roles is not really good for people. So the informal roles are probably better. And you might say, oh, well, a lot of men have been arrogant. And I would argue it's because of those formal roles and titles that leads to this arrogance of people thinking that they're someone special, when clearly, Christianity says that everyone is equally valued by God. And probably the more humble ones, well, not probably, almost certainly the more humble ones, more than the proud and arrogant ones. So that's a thought about how society might be organised, about the deceptions of our current society, and maybe how we're all caught up in these hierarchical systems and obsession with them, and how we can climb up them at the same time as people wanting to tear them down. So I think we don't need to, not to the extent we have them. We probably need some sort of hierarchy, but it doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be paid roles in the sense of, people getting huge amounts of money to organise other people, which is where the money seems to go. It seems to go up the hierarchy, not down to where it's needed. And it tends to be often misallocated. The resources are misallocated because the people at the top don't understand the needs on the ground. They don't understand individual families. And then you get a lot of work and effort and energy going into compliance and making sure people aren't ripping the system off or things are going where they need to. I think that can be much better managed informally in small communities where people work together. Men work together to build each other's houses, predominantly men. I'm not saying women don't have a role. I'm sure they do. In the old cathedrals, the women had a role. They might do some of the woodworking. They'd make the materials for the curtains and blinds and maybe other artefacts. So it's always a joint endeavour, and I'm not saying that we need to stick strictly to role divisions. I'm just saying that's generally how people tend to organise themselves. So in the society that I'm thinking of, yes, people would build houses for each other. Men and women would build the houses and the furnishings for those houses. Probably not on a paid basis, probably just in their spare time, which I imagine they would have more of than they do now, because they'll be helping each other out so much more. Parents with children would have other people come in and teach them from other families who have spare time, so they wouldn't be feeling pressured to do it all themselves. Homeschooling wouldn't be an isolated thing. You'd probably have other people's children around there doing the same sorts of activities together, getting that social interaction that people need. And children probably wouldn't be doing just academic work. They'd be, helping out around the small farm etc. It's sort of things that basically schools are trying to reintroduce now with sort of gardening programs, Stephanie Alexander, etc., etc. That would be there. That would already be there. Maria Montessori 100 years ago envisioned an education system like this, whereby high school basically children are basically learning to run a farm. So it's not to say they can't do the academic skills as well, but they certainly could do that. But yeah, I envision a community of people working together and helping each other out as they need, and get rid of all that hierarchy, all that allocation of resources to highly paid bureaucrats that don't do a very good job, not because they're not trying, just because of the situation of having people so far removed from communities and not understanding their needs, and so far removed from people on the ground, and therefore having to spend a lot of time building processes and procedures to cover everyone's back, to make sure people actually are caring about each other, rather than having a system where the caring about each other is inbuilt. So in Greece during the financial crisis of 2008, a system like this worked. The women who sort of, tend to talk to each other more than the men do, would gather in the churches, and they would work out which families needed which resources, and they would distribute the resources to them. So that was a kind of matriarchal system whereby networks were used, understanding families and their needs, and resources were allocated to them as according to those needs. And I guarantee that would be done much better by those people than by some bureaucratic system in which probably 50% of the resources go into management. So anyway, those are my thoughts on how we could reorganise society. It would be much more sustainable. We're talking about removing fossil fuels, probably using much more localised energy resources. I know of people in sort of these little sort of alternative communities that run steam engines, and they run it on sort of scrap bits of wood, and in that sense you'd have people perhaps cleaning up the forest, picking up the scraps that otherwise would be fuel for forest fires, and using that to generate energy in a sustainable way. And the burnt charcoal can go back into the fields as sort of biochar. So this is, I think, the only real alternative, is to go back to the ways that people have lived for the past, all of human history, and get ourselves off fossil fuels, get ourselves away from this industrial dependence. Solar panels still require a massive industrial system, massive mines, conflict, oil energy, shipping, things being a global supply chain. I think we need to go back to small farms in rural settings. We need to get away from this idea of Australia that has been put on us that we don't divide up the bush. So don't divide up the bush means you have massive farms that can run by sort of one family, but using huge amounts of fossil fuels because that one family couldn't possibly manage it otherwise. That's what don't divide the bush means. Divide up the bush means lots of small, semi-self-sufficient little farmlets of maybe 5 acres or maybe less, and maybe you might have some common areas where people graze, etc., etc. That to me is a sustainable system. I know the developer of Aikido in Japan in the 1800s, late 1800s he was born. His father was described as a prosperous farmer. Do you want to try and guess how much land he had to be a prosperous farmer in Japan? 5 acres. 5 acres is what he needed. Now, Japan has particularly good soil and conditions, so maybe you might need a bit more in Australia to be a prosperous farmer. But you certainly don't need, in many parts of Australia, hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, like we see people having now. And we could get away from these unsustainable cities with their traffic problems, their energy demands, and the increasing expense of infrastructure, which requires more and more energy to build raised railways over houses and tunnels under houses. This is a far cry from what Australians had to pay for in the development of their cities, which was just rolling train tracks across paddocks, basically. So we're getting much more expensive societies to run, and everything else is more expensive, and people are struggling. They're more isolated than ever. There's less love than ever. And I don't think it has to be that way. We have to re-engineer our systems. If we really can care about, the climate, we really care about doing things more sustainably and looking after the earth, then I think we need to get back to small farms and permaculture type techniques and small communities that can look after each other without expensive bureaucracies and big city centered management, in high rises. So those are my thoughts on what a sustainable, loving Christian community might consist of.